The Grand Ballroom of the Blackwood Estate was a spectacle of late Victorian opulence, a dizzying array of silk, crystal, and gaslight. It was the night of the annual Autumn Masquerade, 1898, and the air was thick with the scent of lilies and French perfume. Hundreds of London's elite, masked and anonymous, glided across the polished maple floor, the music of a 70-piece orchestra swelling to fill the immense vaulted space. At the room's central dais, Lord Alastair Blackwood and his wife, Lady Evelyn, surveyed their triumph. Lord Blackwood, a man known for his eccentric genius and unnerving stare, wore a fixed, almost triumphant smile beneath his velvet domino mask. Lady Blackwood, radiant in a gown of midnight blue, carried a subtle tension in her shoulders. She glanced repeatedly toward the massive, multi-tiered crystal chandelier, the centerpiece of the room, as if expecting it to shatter. Whispers had circulated for weeks about Lord Blackwood's increasingly reclusive behavior and his obsessive remodeling of the estate's foundations, rumors dismissed as the folly of an indulgent millionaire. As the clock neared 3 in the morning, the revelry began to peak. The conductor raised his baton, signaling the final, anticipated piece, the Blackwood Harmonic, a new, original composition by Lord Alastair himself. It was a waltz, but one of unsettling minor chords and a peculiar hypnotic rhythm that seemed to subtly quicken the heart rate. As the first measures filled the hall, the couples began the final, graceful spin. In the deep shadows near the east curtain, a figure appeared, a tall man in an unusually plain, black suit, entirely unmasked. He wasn't dancing, he was simply watching. His presence was a stark anomaly in the sea of vibrant costumes, and for a fleeting moment, Lady Evelyn caught his eye. A look of terror, then resignation, crossed her face. She quickly turned back to her partner, Lord Blackwood, who tightened his grip on her hand with an almost painful intensity. The music intensified, the chandeliers seemed to shimmer with an unnatural brightness, and as the waltz reached its climactic, soaring note, the entire ballroom, dancers, musicians, hosts and light, seemed to collectively hold a single breath. Mr. Hemlock, the head groundskeeper, was a man of strict routine. At precisely 5:30 a.m., he approached the Grand Ballroom to begin the pre-dawn sweep, expecting the usual debris of a Blackwood gala: broken glass, discarded favors, and the lingering, stale air of too many people. What he found instead was an unbearable, total silence. He pushed open the massive oak doors, expecting resistance from the footmen who typically secured the room. The doors swung inward easily, revealing not a scene of post-party chaos, but one of immediate cessation. The gaslights were extinguished, but the heavy drapes had not been drawn, allowing the weak, gray morning light to filter in. Every item was exactly where it had been left at the height of the waltz, yet every person was gone. 100 glasses sat on tables, half full of wine or champagne, the bubbles long since evaporated. A lady's satin slipper lay near the dais, its owner apparently having vanished mid-step. The conductor's podium was abandoned, the score for the Blackwood Harmonic lying open. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned chairs, no blood, no shattered crystal beyond a few expected pieces. It was as if the room had been meticulously cleaned by a phantom staff, save for the remaining silent residue of the vanished party. Hemlock walked the length of the hall, his boots echoing unervingly on the maple floor. He checked the side doors and windows, all bolted from the inside. The air was cold, but not freezing, carrying only the faintest trace of jasmine and a sharp metallic tang he couldn't identify. He reached the center of the dance floor, where two couples, captured in the surviving photograph, had been spinning moments before their disappearance. The unsettling detail was that nothing, absolutely nothing, suggested a gradual departure. The guests hadn't walked out, they had simply ceased to exist here. Hemlock staggered backward, the stillness of the room pressing down on him, a heavy, spectral silence far more terrifying than any scream. He knew, instinctively, that the Blackwood Estate had just claimed its most disturbing secret. Inspector Davies arrived from London by midday, his customary grim demeanor intensified by the impossible nature of the case. He was a man of logic and procedure, and the ballroom, silent and perfect, defied both. He found Mr. Hemlock barely coherent, huddled by the library fireplace. Davies commenced the initial investigation, starting with the remaining staff. The cook swore she'd heard the music cease abruptly, not fade, around 3:20 a.m. The maids, sleeping in the servants' wing, claimed the night was eerily quiet. Crucially, Davies established that no carriages had been ordered, and the iron gates of the estate remained locked from the inside. Over 100 people could not simply walk away. The inspector's gaze fell upon Lady Blackwood's private writing desk, miraculously unlocked. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of society invitations, was a crumpled, unsent telegram. It was addressed to her sister in Edinburgh and dated the morning of the ball. The message was terse and desperate. Fear Alistair's great project. Leaving before Waltz. If not heard from, tell authorities look beneath chandelier. Evelyn. Davies immediately ordered the floor beneath the central chandelier be examined, but the polished wood showed no sign of having been disturbed. The telegram, however, gave weight to the idea that Lord Blackwood was the architect of the catastrophe. His secondary finding was in the orchestra pit, an extra piece of paper tucked into the conductor's score. It wasn't music but a set of handwritten mathematical notations and a single Greek letter, phi, which Davies recognized as the symbol for the golden ratio. It was a clear confirmation that Blackwood's great project was not merely a party but something scientific, or perhaps, darkly occult. The trail led not to a crime of passion or robbery, but to a chilling crime of intellectual obsession. The note was stained with a faint, crystalline residue, a potential lead in a case devoid of physical evidence. The single piece of solid evidence was located not by Davies, but by a junior maid cleaning the library mantelpiece. A small, preserved tintype photograph. It was a rushed, imperfect exposure, clearly taken by a guest with a pocket camera moments before the finale. Davies studied the image, the last visual record of over 100 vanished souls. The picture was dark, sepia-toned, and faintly blurred, but it captured the terrifying normalcy of the final waltz. The couples, including Lord and Lady Blackwood in the foreground, were caught mid-turn. Lady Evelyn's face, despite the mask, carried that look of veiled anxiety Davies had read about in the telegram. The photographer, likely distracted by the crowd, had not been precise. This imperfection, however, proved invaluable. The lens had captured more than the dancers. In the deep background, near the ornate plaster molding of the ceiling, was a subtle distortion. It wasn't dust or a scratch. It was a shimmering, almost liquid ripple in the very air, a phenomenon that defied the physics of light and glass. It was directly above the spot where the conductor was positioned. Davies used a powerful magnifying glass to examine the couple closest to the camera. The man, a known solicitor named Mr. Thorne, had his eyes wide and fixed on his partner. Her hand, resting on his shoulder, appeared oddly elongated, the fingers blurred in a way inconsistent with the rest of her body's slight movement. Most chillingly, in the far background, positioned near the unmasked man Hemlock had later reported, a faint but distinct shadow was visible beneath one of the massive ballroom arches. This shadow was too dense for the current gaslight, too angular to be natural, and seemed to possess an unnatural depth, as if it were a void in the fabric of the image itself. The photograph wasn't a record of a party, it was a snapshot of a threshold opening, with the shadow lurking just outside the bounds of their reality. The tintype was silent, yet it screamed of an invisible force. Inspector Davies, baffled by the technological implications of the tintype and the telegram, sought answers in the oldest of places, the village archives. He knew that sometimes, the most logical explanation was buried in forgotten local folklore. He interviewed the village rector, Father Silas, a man who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the region's past. Father Silas reluctantly revealed the enduring legend surrounding the Blackwood land, a story far darker than mere social gossip. The Blackwood family had only acquired the land in the late 17th century. Before that, the area was known locally as the Ground of the Hungry Well. Legends, dating back to Saxon times, claimed that the land possessed an unnatural hunger, manifesting only during gatherings of great joy or large crowds. The theory was that the sheer collective vitality and euphoria drew something from beneath the soil. The rector produced a brittle, yellowed town ledger from 1775, noting an unexplained incident that occurred before the estate was built. A traveling harvest festival, comprising over 50 people, had vanished overnight from the very spot where the ballroom now stood. The record concluded simply, The tents remained, the people did not. The land took its due. Father Silas revealed that Lord Alastair Blackwood was deeply aware of this history. He had found notes in the church records indicating Blackwood had meticulously researched the folklore, particularly the alignment of the building to the old, sealed well rumored to be the focal point of the anomaly. The rector believed Blackwood wasn't trying to escape the curse, he was trying to harness it. The Blackwoods hadn't just held a ball, they had, perhaps unwittingly, provided the exact conditions, a large gathering, intense emotion, and a specific hypnotic cadence of music, to reactivate a dormant, ancient force. Davies left the rectory with a chilling new hypothesis. The Vanishing was not a sophisticated murder or a failed experiment, but a successful, catastrophic occult summoning facilitated by Lord Blackwood's scientific obsession. The modern ballroom was merely a cage built over an old, insatiable trap. Davies had exhausted the historical and personnel leads. It was time for hard evidence. He called in Professor Eldred Vance, a skeptical physicist and expert in chronometry from the Royal Society, to analyze the timepieces found at the scene. Vance's initial findings were disturbing. The massive grandfather clock in the ballroom foyer, the delicate lady's watch found near the dais, and 5 other pocket watches recovered from the coat check, all had stopped at precisely 3:17 a.m. It wasn't 3:17 and 30 seconds for one, or 3:18 for another. The cessation was simultaneous and absolute. "This is not a failure of mechanism, Inspector," Vance declared, his voice thin with professional unease. "Clocks stop for myriad reasons, but never with such perfect synchronicity unless subjected to an overwhelming, instantaneous external force." Vance theorized 2 possibilities, both bordering on the fantastic. The first was an intense, localized electromagnetic pulse, powerful enough to disrupt the delicate balance wheels of all timepieces, but leaving the glass globes and metal frames intact. If so, what generated it? The second theory was metaphysical, and Vance delivered it with a visible shudder. He called it a temporal void. He suggested that the ballroom had not merely experienced an energy surge, but a momentary cessation of time itself. For that single instant at 3:17 a.m., reality in that specific space had been fractured, the clocks reflecting the moment they were pulled outside the bounds of the natural flow. The professor's attention shifted to the faint, crystalline residue Davies had found on the Greek notation. Vance tested the substance, identifying it as a highly unstable, mineral compound, a material with unusual piezoelectric properties, meaning it could convert mechanical stress, like the vibration of music or the rhythmic stomping of a waltz, into electrical energy. This solidified the terrifying symmetry of Lord Blackwood's plan: the rhythmic waltz, the architectural geometry, and this unique mineral. Blackwood hadn't simply created a party, he had built a resonating chamber, a deliberate machine designed to charge the room and, at the climactic moment, overload the physical constants of time and space. The clocks had not stopped, they had recorded the moment the ballroom left the present. Inspector Davies and Professor Vance tracked down the only known survivor connected to the event, Mr. Arthur Finch, the elderly second flutist of the orchestra. Finch, a man frail and shaking, had been dismissed early due to a sudden, inexplicable migraine, narrowly escaping the grand illusion. Davies found Finch in his modest London apartment, rocking slowly and clutching a crucifix. Finch didn't need prompting, the memory was clearly agonizing. He spoke not of a party, but of a ritual. "The music, it wasn't a waltz, Inspector," Finch whispered hoarsely. "It was a lock, a key." Lord Blackwood insisted on perfect adherence to his score, the Blackwood harmonic. He composed it himself, and it was unlike anything I've ever played. It had a peculiar, unnatural cadence, a repetitive, rising sequence of notes that seemed to vibrate not in the air, but in your bones. Finch recounted the moments leading up to 3:17 a.m. He described the conductor, Mr. Harrison, sweating profusely, fighting to keep the orchestra on the unsettling tempo. Finch remembered looking up at the chandelier, noticing the light wasn't just bright, it was pulsing in time with the music's climax. The rhythmic stomp of the dancers on the highly resonant maple floor, combined with the vibrations of the strings, created a sustained, powerful drone. "The final note, Inspector. It wasn't a proper finish," Finch insisted, tears welling in his eyes. It was a suspended cord, held too long, agonizingly long. It felt like the air itself was under pressure. I dropped my flute and ran, my ears screaming, convinced the roof was collapsing. But when I reached the servants' entrance, the noise simply stopped. No crash, no echo. Just instantaneous, dead silence. Finch's testimony confirmed Vance's theory of the resonating chamber. The music and the dance were the mechanical input, converted by the hidden apparatus beneath the floor into the disruptive energy spike. He begged Davies to destroy the sheet music found on the podium, claiming it was cursed. The composition wasn't for entertainment, it was a blueprint for transcendence, or perhaps, destruction, written by a man who sought to control the forces of time itself. Returning to the ballroom, Davies and Vance studied the tintype photograph again. Vance noticed the subtle misalignment of the heavy plaster molding in the central archway, a detail too insignificant for a casual viewer. Acting on Lady Blackwood's cryptic telegram and the theory of her husband's design, Davies pressed a decorative rosette near the arch. With a low, grinding sound, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a small, concealed study. The air inside was stale and cold, yet electric. This was Lord Blackwood's true workshop, a room designed for secrecy and obsession. It was furnished sparsely, a steel-topped table, various measuring instruments, and a collection of texts on hermetic philosophy, astronomical movements, and theoretical physics. The centerpiece of the room was not a desk, but a meticulously constructed scale model of the ballroom. Fine copper wires ran from the model's miniature chandelier down through the floorboards and connected to a small, crystalline node fixed where the old well was rumored to be. This confirmed that Blackwood had designed the room to be a vast, architectural capacitor. Scattered across the table were sheets of parchment covered in cryptic journals and engineering schematics. The handwriting was precise, but the content was manic. Blackwood detailed his desire to find the harmonic chord, the precise frequency and rhythm that would allow a temporary, controlled shift in dimensional barriers. He wrote not of gold or power, but of symmetry and achieving absolute temporal perfection. He believed the Victorian era, with its precise engineering and spiritual upheaval, was the only time such a feat could be achieved. One chilling entry, dated the day before the ball, declared, "The geometry is sound. The crystalline charge is primed. The final input requires only the energy of 100 euphoric hearts beating as one, driven by the harmonic. They shall not be lost. They shall be perfectly translated." Davies realized Blackwood hadn't intended murder, but an experimental translation of mass into an unknown dimension, using the sheer kinetic and emotional energy of his guests. The ballroom was not a murder scene, it was a vortex generator, and the final waltz was the activation sequence. Tucked inside Lord Blackwood's concealed study, beneath a stack of his astronomical charts, Inspector Davies found Lady Evelyn's small, leather-bound personal journal, the mirror image of his obsessive notes. Her meticulous handwriting contrasted sharply with her husband's frenzied scrawl, detailing not science, but a spiraling emotional descent. The early entries spoke of Alistair's charm and genius, but the tone darkened dramatically as his great project consumed him. Lady Evelyn described the unsettling sound of drilling and masonry late at night, and the bizarre deliveries of specialized minerals and intricate clockwork mechanisms. She wrote with a terrible clarity about her growing realization: Alistair wasn't building a scientific breakthrough, he was building a trap. An entry from 6 weeks prior read, "He speaks only of symmetry and vibration. He claims to be the first man to tame time itself. He watches the guests at our dinners with a calculating look, assessing their vital energy, as if they are simply fuel for his ridiculous machine. I have become afraid to touch him, afraid to even stand still near the central chandelier." Her terror peaked the day before the ball. She had inadvertently seen his final schematic, a complex equation that used the rhythmic movement of 100 waltzing couples as the necessary mechanical energy to activate the dimensional shift. She realized the masquerade was not a celebration, but the final, required step in his experiment. He insisted on an enormous crowd for harmonic resonance. "I see now I was invited to my own funeral, or worse, my own banishment. I have tried to warn them, but no one listens to a frightened wife. I must flee tonight, before the final waltz." I must destroy the mechanism before he unleashes this cosmic disaster. The journal abruptly stopped on the morning of the ball. Davies and Vance exchanged a grim look. Lady Evelyn hadn't failed to send her telegram. She had run out of time to act on her desperate resolve. Her final words, however, contained a veiled clue, a mention of a loose floor tile in the orchestra pit, where she had planned to hide a final, desperate warning, or perhaps attempt sabotage. Her fear was the final, tragic piece of evidence confirming Lord Blackwood's intent. Professor Vance meticulously laid out Lord Blackwood's schematics and journals on the steel table in the hidden study. The scientist, initially skeptical of any metaphysical involvement, was now forced to confront the chilling reality. Blackwood had devised a sophisticated, if monstrously misguided, piece of dimensional engineering. Vance focused on the equation utilizing the Greek letter phi, the golden ratio. It's a foundational concept in art and nature, Inspector, Vance explained, pointing to a diagram of the ballroom. Blackwood wasn't just building a house, he was building a perfectly proportioned conduit based on phi. The dimensions of the ballroom, the placement of the chandeliers, and even the curvature of the main archways all adhered to this divine proportion. The core of the great project, Vance deduced, was an attempt to create a localized, sustainable rift in spacetime. The elements were the architecture, the ballroom, acting as the fixed, geometrically perfect resonating chamber. The energy source, the piezoelectric mineral beneath the floor, as theorized in Chapter 6, converting mechanical energy into a targeted electrical charge. The catalyst, the hundreds of human bodies, their heartbeats and collective energy providing the sheer vitality needed to trigger the event. The frequency, the Blackwood harmonic, the specially composed waltz. Its unnerving tempo was designed not to entertain, but to force the dancers into a specific, repetitive, and geometrically pleasing pattern of movement. The waltz was the activation key, Vance stated, running a finger over a diagram showing the movement of the dancers. At the climax, 3:17 a.m., the combined energy of the music's sustained chord and the precise, symmetrical motion of the couples created a harmonic overload. It was the specific human element, the living symmetry of the dance, that was meant to open the temporary gateway. Lord Blackwood's aim wasn't simple travel. His journal spoke of reaching an unwritten octave of existence, a dimension just outside their own temporal frame, where reality was perfectly balanced. He didn't kill the guests. He used their kinetic and emotional energy to translate them, pulling them out of the current temporal stream and into his vision of perfect, suspended symmetry. They were still waltzing, Vance theorized, just not in this world. Davies and Vance decided they needed to reconstruct the environment as closely as possible, using the hidden study schematics as a guide. They dimmed the electric lanterns currently illuminating the ballroom, replacing them with gaslights positioned exactly where the original fixtures had been. They also procured a tuning fork set to the precise, dominant frequency noted in the Blackwood harmonic score. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. With the rhythmic hiss of the gas lamps and the shadows lengthening, the ballroom felt alive with its recent, terrible memory. Vance carefully struck the tuning fork. The pure, sustained note, though silent to the normal ear, began to resonate within the large, phi-proportioned space. As the vibration permeated the room, Davies directed their attention back to the tintype photograph. They projected an enlarged image of the photo onto a screen, focusing on the subtle distortion near the ceiling. With the room now echoing the correct harmonic frequency, the anomaly on the screen seemed to gain definition. "It's a temporal shimmer," Vance breathed, his scientific skepticism crumbling. "Not a scratch on the plate." The lens captured the air itself buckling. The area of distortion looked less like a ripple and more like a pool of heat rising in cold air, twisting the light that passed through it. Then, a sudden, chilling event occurred in the room itself. A globe on one of the gaslights, a considerable distance from the tuning fork, began to flicker and pulse. Not randomly, but in a distinct, rhythmic pattern mirroring the cadence of the waltz. As the flickering intensified, the air around the central chandelier suddenly felt colder. The metallic tang Mr. Hemlock had smelled briefly returned, and Davies felt a profound pressure building in his skull. Vance snatched up the tuning fork and silenced it. The pulse of the gaslight instantly stopped, and the normal temperature returned. That was a feedback loop, Vance concluded, rubbing his temples. The space retains the charge. When we hit the harmonic, even a fraction of it, the ballroom attempted to complete the circuit. The lights pulsing confirmed that the lighting grid, connected to the central chandelier, was an integral part of Blackwood's apparatus, a final means of discharging the concentrated human energy and achieving his catastrophic translation. They realized they were playing with forces far beyond simple murder, dangerously close to reactivating the void. Driven by the near activation of the temporal loop, Davies and Vance returned to Mr. Hemlock. The groundskeeper, still haunted and now slightly fortified with a generous amount of brandy, finally confessed to holding back a critical piece of information, a secret he had initially withheld out of fear of Lord Blackwood's retaliation, even after his disappearance. "It was the digging, Inspector," Hemlock rasped, clutching the brandy glass. "Weeks before the ball, His Lordship commissioned me to supervise the excavation of the soil directly beneath the ballroom's new maple floor. I knew about the old well, the hungry well, but he wasn't interested in water. He was interested in what was around it." Hemlock led them out to the estate grounds, pointing to a secluded, overgrown area roughly corresponding to the exact center of the ballroom above. He revealed that Blackwood had directed a small, discreet team to dig a massive, circular trench. This wasn't for foundation work, it was to access and reinforce the geometry of the ancient well structure itself. During the excavation, Hemlock recalled seeing Lord Blackwood place numerous copper rods into the earth around the well's stone lip. Most disturbingly, he also buried large, irregular chunks of a peculiar, glowing, silvery blue mineral. This mineral, Hemlock said, had a faint, sickly sweet odor and pulsated faintly in the dark, reminding him of a dying heart. He described Blackwood handling it with near-religious reverence. He called it the resonance stone, Hemlock confessed, his eyes wide. He said it held the key to anchoring the structure. He said the metal rods would channel something from the sky, and the stone would pull something from below. It sounded like madness, but he paid me handsomely to keep silent. Hemlock's account confirmed Vance's final piece of the puzzle. The subterranean apparatus was not just a foundation, it was the engine of the dimensional rift. The copper rods were antennae, and the glowing mineral, likely a variant of the piezoelectric compound, was the hypercharged core. The well, long believed to be cursed, was actually a natural nexus point of energy, which Blackwood had exploited. The entire estate was not a home, but an enormous, beautifully disguised temporal machine, powered by earth, metal, music, and the collective life force of its guests. Armed with the coordinates from Hemlock and the structural schematics from the hidden study, Davies and Vance returned to the ballroom, now prepared for decisive action. The unsent telegram's final instruction, "Look beneath the chandelier," was finally actionable. They used a crowbar to pry up the perfectly polished maple floorboards directly beneath the central crystal fixture. The removal of the wood revealed not foundation stone, but a shallow, subterranean vault constructed of brick and iron. Inside sat the chilling, inert heart of Lord Blackwood's experiment, the apparatus of translation. It was a complex, rudimentary machine, an unnerving fusion of Victorian clockwork and occult geometry. A central coil of polished copper, shaped like a massive Mobius strip, encircled the dark, sealed opening of the old well. Running into this coil were thick, insulated cables that climbed toward where the grand chandelier hung above. The entire device was meticulously insulated with a thick, dull layer of lead, confirming Blackwood's knowledge of the immense energy he planned to release. At the base of the coil, embedded in a matrix of quartz and clay, was a large, irregular chunk of the silvery blue mineral Hemlock had described, the resonance stone. It was now dull, its faint glow extinguished, but traces of the crystalline residue Vance had identified were still visible. Vance carefully examined the mechanism. "It's a crude but potent energy capacitor, Inspector," he murmured, his voice hushed. The dancer's kinetic energy was channeled down through the floor and into this coil, powered by the resonance stone and synchronized by the chandelier's frequency. At the moment of the harmonic climax, 3:17 a.m., the coil would have reached maximum charge, creating a localized, non-physical tear. Crucially, the machine was silent, but intact. The levers were engaged, the copper coil was perfectly aligned, and there were no signs of structural failure or explosion. It hadn't broken down, it had simply ceased to function after achieving its horrific purpose. Blackwood had succeeded in opening the gateway, but the mechanism had simply shut off once the necessary mass, the entire party, was pulled through. The silence wasn't a failure, but a chilling marker of absolute success. The machine had done its job perfectly. With the terrifying apparatus of translation exposed, the pieces of the mystery clicked into place. The missing people were neither murdered nor fled, they had been temporarily displaced. Lord Blackwood had successfully used their collective energy to push them out of the Victorian present and into an adjacent, non-physical reality, a place he called perfect symmetry. Professor Vance cautiously touched the cold copper coil. The energy required for such a mass displacement, it must have been immense. It would have instantaneously vaporized any witnesses nearby. Yet the room is pristine. Davies pondered this while examining the sealed well opening within the coil. He designed it to be clean. He wanted the perfect translation, not a messy explosion. He was trying to prove a theorem, not commit a crime in our conventional sense. Suddenly, Vance stiffened. He pointed toward the inert resonance stone at the base of the coil. From the heart of the dormant machine, a sound, faint, almost inaudible, began to emanate. It wasn't the sound of machinery, but something far more unsettling. It was the final, sustained note of the Blackwood harmonic. The sound was not loud enough to register on any normal instrument, but it carried an unnerving quality, a sound that seemed to exist inside the listener's ear. It was the same agonized, suspended chord that Mr. Finch, the flutist, had described just before the silence. The note was being held, endlessly, emanating from the mechanism that had translated the dancers. "They are still there," Vance whispered, horrified, his face pale in the gaslight. "The coil isn't dead, it's locked in resonance. The music hasn't finished. The guests are trapped in the moment of transition, the final, eternal climax of the waltz." The chilling realization settled over them. The 100 guests, Lord and Lady Blackwood among them, were not at peace. They were suspended in a timeless void, eternally held in the pose of their final dance, their kinetic and emotional energy still resonating, emitting the faint, desperate echo of the music that doomed them. Lord Blackwood achieved his perfect symmetry, but at the cost of his guests' endless, silent imprisonment. The machine's only failure was that it couldn't silence the spectral reverberation of its success. The investigation closed not with arrests, but with a complex and deeply unsatisfying narrative. Inspector Davies' official report cited a tragic, localized gas explosion, a lie necessary to maintain public order and hide the truth of Lord Blackwood's horrifying temporal science. The Blackwood Estate was seized by the Crown, the apparatus of translation was meticulously dismantled by Professor Vance's team, and the sealed well was filled with hundreds of tons of concrete, burying the lingering hum of the final waltz forever. The mystery became an enduring local legend, whispered behind closed doors, the night the ballroom ate the guests. Davies and Vance, the only two men who knew the truth, never spoke of the harmonic chord again. Vance retired from the Royal Society shortly thereafter, unable to reconcile the clean, perfect logic of physics with the monstrous reality of Blackwood's success. The lasting legacy was the single tintype photograph. It was kept locked away in a private police vault, its existence officially denied. Davies would occasionally pull it out in the quiet solitude of his study, gazing into the sepia tones of 1898. He often focused on the couple in the foreground, Lord and Lady Blackwood. He knew that somewhere, in an existence just outside their own, they were still held in that eternal turn, the crescendo of the music perpetually sustained. But one night, with a new and powerful lens, Davies noticed a detail he had overlooked for months, a detail that provided a final, chilling horror to Blackwood's perfect symmetry. He looked at the face of the unmasked man in the far background, the anomaly who had appeared just as the waltz began. Under magnification, the man's posture was not of a casual observer. His body was stiff, his eyes wide, and he was staring not at the dancers, but directly into the camera lens. The unmasked man was Lord Alastair Blackwood. The man in the foreground, dancing with Lady Evelyn, had been an intricate mask, a distraction. Blackwood, the true orchestrator, had stood outside the circle, ensuring the process was flawless. But what did the presence of his unmasked self, staring out from the photo moments before the translation, imply? Davies understood. Lord Blackwood hadn't intended to be translated with his guests. He had calculated the precise moment of the rift and had stepped out, believing he could witness his great achievement and return to this world. But the rift had closed on him, too, trapping him in the periphery, the final, spectral sentinel of his vanishing ball. He was the last person seen, forever captured staring, not at his victims, but at the reality he had just permanently left behind, trapped in the eternity of the dance's final moment.